In a small orphanage in California, a young boy named Calvin loved playing basketball with his two best friends, Murph and Reg. Calvin was shorter than other kids, but he had big dreams. Every day, he hoped someone would adopt him and give him a real family. One day while playing, a big bully named Ox came over. Ox always picked on Calvin because he was small. Ox wanted to play one-on-one with Calvin. If Calvin lost, he would give up his basketball jersey. Murph and Reg tried to stop Calvin, but he was tired of running away. He decided to play. Calvin played hard, but Ox was bigger and stronger. Calvin lost and had to give up his jersey. Ox put on Calvin's jersey and tore it up in front of everyone. Calvin felt sad but stayed strong. He said when his new family adopted him, they would buy him many jerseys. Ox laughed and said no one would adopt Calvin. But Calvin believed he was special and someone would want him. Calvin watched a happy family on TV and dreamed about having parents like that. Then Stan, who ran the orphanage, turned off the TV. He told the kids they had to sell candy at the Staples Center, where the Los Angeles Knights basketball team played. The kids didn't like selling candy, but had no choice. That night, Calvin couldn't sell much candy. He stopped trying and watched the Knights game from outside with Murph. Calvin's favorite player was Tracy, but Tracy missed an important shot, and the team lost. Calvin felt sad watching his team lose again. After the game, Calvin saw Coach Wagner leaving. Wagner looked upset about losing. Calvin went up to Wagner and said he was sorry the team lost. They talked about basketball and agreed on why the team wasn't playing well. Wagner wondered why Calvin was out so late. By himself, Calvin told Wagner he lived in an orphanage and was selling candy. Wagner wanted to buy candy from Calvin, but Calvin wasn't sure the money really helped the orphanage. Wagner liked Calvin's honesty. He asked if Calvin had ever seen a Knights game. Calvin said no. So Wagner told him where to get free tickets. Calvin was very happy and thanked Wagner. The next day, married couples came to the orphanage looking to adopt children. Calvin got excited, but Ox said the couples only wanted younger kids. Calvin looked around and saw Ox was right. He felt sad, wondering if anyone would ever want him. Calvin went outside feeling disappointed. Sister Teresa brought out a box of donated clothes and toys. She gave Murph a winter coat. When she did this, a pair of old sneakers fell out. Calvin picked them up. Calvin asked Sister Teresa about the shoes. She said they belonged to a famous basketball player. Calvin tried them on, and they fit perfectly. Sister Teresa couldn't remember the player's name, but Calvin saw the letters MJ on the shoe. Calvin got excited, thinking these might be Michael Jordan's shoes. Calvin, Reg, and Murph looked at the shoes with wonder. Then Ox tried to take them away. Calvin didn't want to give them up because he believed they belonged to the famous player. Ox said they only got old things nobody wanted at the orphanage. Ox grabbed the shoes and threw them onto the power lines above. Calvin felt upset watching his special shoes hanging where he couldn't reach them. That night, it started raining. Calvin woke Murph and said they needed to get the shoes back. Murph thought maybe Ox was right, but Calvin was sure they belonged to Michael Jordan. Reg joined them, and all three went outside in the rain. Calvin climbed a tall tree to reach the power line. When he finally grabbed the shoes, lightning struck the line. Calvin got shocked and fell from the tree. He wasn't hurt, but when he looked at the shoes, he saw small lightning sparks on them. This made them seem even more magical. The next day, Calvin found Wagner's tickets. He asked Reg and Murph to come watch the game. When Ox threatened to tell Stan, Calvin invited him too. At the game, the boys watched the Knights play badly, losing by many points. At halftime, Frank, the team's manager, looked angry. Frank told Tracy they needed something special to get fans excited. Frank announced that one lucky person would play one-on-one against Tracy. They picked a random seat number, and it was Calvin's seat. Calvin couldn't believe his luck, so excited to play against his favorite player. Calvin walked to the court while fans cheered. Frank quietly told Tracy to let Calvin score a couple times, but Tracy said he'd only let Calvin score once. The game started and Calvin felt nervous but excited. Then something amazing happened. Calvin dribbled past Tracy and scored his first point. Everyone cheered loudly. Then Calvin scored again with an even better move. Calvin couldn't believe how well he was playing. Tracy was shocked. He decided to play seriously because he didn't want to look bad. For the last point, Calvin threw the ball off the backboard and jumped up to slam dunk it. Everyone stood up and cheered. Calvin had beaten Tracy 3-0. Meanwhile, Stan sat in his truck playing chess, having no idea what was happening. Inside, fans went crazy cheering for Calvin. Frank saw how excited everyone was and went to find Stan. Frank asked if he was Calvin's guardian. The next day, Frank and Wagner visited Stan. Frank wanted Calvin to join the Knights. Wagner was surprised, saying Calvin was too short for the NBA. But Frank's plan was just to fill stadium seats with excited fans. Frank offered Stan $5,000 to let Calvin join for one day. Stan sounded greedy hearing about money. Wagner didn't like Stan's attitude. Frank offered more money, and Stan quickly agreed. He only cared about money, not what was best for Calvin. Later, Calvin told Reg and Murph about his amazing basketball experience. Murph asked how Calvin played so well suddenly. Calvin noticed something important. Before wearing the MJ sneakers, he wasn't good at basketball. Murph threw Calvin a basketball to test this. Calvin shot the ball and made it perfectly. Murph said Calvin was like basketball Cinderella because the magical shoes made him better. Calvin agreed, saying no one else could know their secret. But Ox had been hiding nearby and heard everything. That night, the friends went to Staples Center for Calvin's first day with the Knights. Calvin entered the locker room and greeted all the players. He told Tracy he was sorry for embarrassing him. Tracy said it was okay, and player Joe told Calvin to use the locker next to him. Frank brought Calvin his team jersey and new basketball shoes. Calvin wanted to wear his own sneakers. Frank said Calvin had to wear the new shoes, but Calvin said he played better in his own. Frank laughed, saying Calvin wouldn't play in the actual game. Calvin felt disappointed. He asked Wagner what he was really there for. Wagner explained Frank only wanted Calvin to bring more fans. Calvin wasn't happy, but Wagner said it was still special being part of the team. When the game started, Calvin sat on the bench watching. He felt excited being close to players he used to watch on TV. But the Knights started losing again. Wagner called timeout to give new instructions. While Wagner talked to players, Calvin interrupted with an idea to help the team. Wagner liked Calvin's idea and told Tracy to try it. Tracy said he wouldn't follow a kid's plan, but Wagner said they had to try something different. Wagner surprised everyone by putting Calvin in the game. All players were shocked. Frank asked if Wagner knew what he was doing. Wagner said he was the coach, doing what was best for the team. As Calvin got ready, he realized he wasn't wearing his MJ sneakers. He felt scared, thinking he couldn't play well without them. Tracy passed the ball to Calvin, but Calvin kept passing it back. Everyone wondered what was wrong. Calvin called timeout, saying he needed the bathroom. Wagner was confused, but Calvin ran to find his MJ sneakers. Calvin put on his special shoes and ran back. He played exactly like he told Wagner. Calvin scored many points. Wagner and everyone couldn't believe how good Calvin was. Calvin helped the Knights win. Frank was happy, calling himself a genius. The next day, the Knights gave Calvin a big contract with lots of money. Calvin became famous. He packed to leave the orphanage and travel with the team. Stan came to Calvin's room, saying he was proud. Stan told Calvin that anyone wanting to adopt him now only wanted his money. Calvin's contract wouldn't allow adoption anyway. Calvin asked what Stan meant. Stan explained he'd signed Calvin's contract as his guardian, and as long as Calvin played for Knights, this couldn't change. Calvin joined the Knights on an airplane to their next game. Wagner told Tracy he needed to mentor Calvin and be his roommate. Tracy didn't want this, but Wagner said it was his job. At their hotel, Calvin was excited to room with Tracy. He talked about how happy he was, but Tracy didn't share his excitement. Tracy said he didn't want to waste time playing around with Calvin. That night, Tracy got ready to leave. Calvin asked if they could go out together, but Tracy wanted to go alone. Tracy showed Calvin how to call room service for free food. Calvin didn't believe he could get things for free, but Tracy told him to try. After Tracy left, Calvin called room service and ordered lots of food. Later, Tracy returned with a woman named Janet. They saw Calvin on the floor surrounded by scattered food everywhere. Tracy felt embarrassed. Janet thought Calvin was cute. The three went out together, and Tracy felt jealous watching Janet pay attention to Calvin. Janet asked Tracy what nickname he had for Calvin, but Tracy said he didn't have one. Back at the hotel, Calvin asked Tracy to pray with him before bed. Calvin ended his prayer asking God to bless Tracy. Tracy looked surprised by this kindness. Calvin asked if Tracy wanted to pray for his parents, but Tracy said his parents were dead. Calvin felt sorry for Tracy, saying they were alike because he was also an orphan. Calvin fell asleep and started snoring loudly. This kept Tracy awake all night. Next morning, Wagner noticed Tracy looked tired. When Wagner asked what happened, Calvin interrupted, telling him about Janet coming to their room and staying past midnight. Wagner was disappointed in Tracy for breaking team rules. Wagner said Tracy would be suspended if it happened again. Tracy felt angry at Calvin because Calvin's snoring kept him awake, not staying up with Janet. Calvin apologized for talking too much. Tracy said they needed to do things differently. At their next game, Calvin played amazingly and helped the Knights win. In following games, Calvin continued being the best player, and the Knights became a top team. Calvin sent gifts to his orphanage friends. One night, visiting the orphanage, Ox tried stealing Calvin's sneakers. Stan saw this and told Ox to stay away because Calvin was valuable to him. Ox said Calvin's sneakers were why he was good at basketball, but Stan only cared that no one hurt Calvin because Calvin made him money. Next day, Calvin played games with Jode when Tracy said he was going to buy allergy medicine and sleeping pills. Calvin asked to come, but Tracy told him to stay. Calvin felt disappointed, but Jode said not to worry about Tracy's behavior. Jode said Tracy didn't even talk to his own family. Calvin was surprised, thinking Tracy's parents were dead. Jode explained Tracy still had a father, but they didn't speak. Tracy left and got in his car. Calvin surprised him by appearing in the back seat. Calvin explained he'd taken the stairs and got into the car faster. Tracy stopped at the pharmacy. By mistake, he took sleeping pills instead of allergy medicine. Back in the car, the pills made Tracy drowsy. Soon Tracy fell asleep, leaving Calvin no choice but to drive them back. Next morning, Tracy learned Calvin couldn't play their next game for breaking curfew. Tracy was confused until Jode asked how he thought he got home. Tracy realized Calvin had driven them back and thanked him for helping avoid suspension. Tracy gave Calvin the nickname Sea Dog, and Calvin felt happy having a special name for Tracy. Next day, Calvin was at the orphanage complaining about geometry test preparation. He noticed couples walking around. Murph explained all the couples were there to meet Calvin. Calvin thought this was good news, but Murph looked sad, saying it didn't help anyone else. Calvin wondered why his friends seemed upset. Stan was on the phone with Wagner, angry the coach had sent couples to see Calvin. Wagner said nothing in Calvin's contract prevented adoption. Calvin asked Stan why he'd lied about adoption being impossible. Stan said people only wanted Calvin's money. Calvin still wanted to meet the couples. Stan agreed to introduce him to candidates. Calvin met Stan's selected couples, but they all seemed strange. Stan had hired fake couples to make Calvin not want adoption. Feeling upset, Calvin visited Tracy at his city house. Tracy asked what was wrong, and Calvin said he was having a terrible day. His best friend seemed angry, and Stan had set him up with awful parents. Calvin also struggled with geometry. Tracy said he could help with math homework, but first Calvin needed to call Murph to ensure they were still friends. Calvin called Murph and invited him to Tracy's house. Tracy painted triangles on walls to teach Calvin geometry. They had a paint fight, and when Murph arrived, he joined the fun. Next day, the Knights won another game. Frank praised Tracy and Calvin for working together and changing the team's luck. Frank said if they won one more game, they'd make playoffs. Following day, Reg and Murph asked if Calvin had found right parents. Calvin said no, and Murph suggested it might be because Calvin had someone else in mind. Murph said Tracy could adopt him. Calvin laughed at this idea, saying Tracy wasn't interested in families because he didn't talk to his own father. Reg and Murph were shocked. They couldn't understand why anyone would have a father and not talk to him. Next day, Calvin brought Tracy's father to surprise him. When Tracy saw his dad, he got very angry. He sent Calvin away, telling him to mind his own business. That night, the Knights lost. Wagner was upset they'd now have to be a harder team for playoffs. He was angry at Tracy and Calvin because they hadn't played well together. After Wagner left, Tracy tried talking to Calvin, but Calvin had already gone. Next morning, Calvin returned to the orphanage, telling friends he wasn't sure he'd ever get adopted. Murph told him not to give up hope. Then a nice couple named Mr. and Mrs. Boyd came to meet Calvin. Seeing Calvin might leave soon, Stan asked Ox if he was sure Calvin's shoes were his secret to basketball skills. Ox said he was certain. Stan gave Calvin new shoes, convincing him to change them so the Boyds would like him more. Calvin agreed and gave his MJ sneakers to Murph for safekeeping. Calvin went to the Boyds' house for dinner. Meanwhile, Murph put on the sneakers to test them. When he tried shooting basketball, he missed badly and realized the shoes only worked for Calvin. Then Ox and bullies came to take Murph's mother's picture away. Stan appeared and burned part of the picture, forcing Murph to reveal where Calvin's sneakers were hidden. Murph didn't want to lose his only picture of his mother, so he told them where to find the shoes. Stan took the shoes and met a dangerous man named Mr. Williams. Stan borrowed $100,000 to bet against the Knights in their next game. Mr. Williams was surprised Stan was so confident the Knights would lose. Stan said he had a feeling Calvin would play badly. Meanwhile, Tracy couldn't stop thinking about Calvin. Janet noticed and asked what was wrong. Tracy remembered fun times with Calvin and decided to make up with his father. Calvin's dinner with the Boyds went very well, and they agreed to adopt him. Next day, Tracy saw Calvin in the locker room, saying he had big news. Before Tracy could speak, the Boyds entered. Calvin introduced them as his new parents. Tracy was shocked, but congratulated them. When Calvin asked about Tracy's news, Tracy said it was nothing important. Reg and Murph called Calvin, telling him Stan had taken his shoes. Even though the game was starting, Calvin left the stadium and rushed to the orphanage. Wagner and the team noticed Calvin was missing, but had to play their most important game without him. At the orphanage, Calvin got Murph, Reg, and other kids to tie Stan to a chair. They demanded he tell them the safe combination where he'd hidden the sneakers. Stan refused to talk. When Ox came in, he almost freed Stan, but Calvin told him Stan didn't care about any of them, and they needed to stick together. Ox thought about this and realized Calvin was right about Stan not caring. Since Ox knew the safe code, he unlocked it and gave Calvin his sneakers back. All kids rushed to the stadium together. Stan freed himself and called Mr. Williams to send men after the children, so they wouldn't ruin their bet. Mr. Williams sent thugs immediately. Calvin got past the dangerous men and reached the stadium. But Stan was waiting there. Stan demanded Calvin give up his sneakers because his game was over. Calvin knocked Stan down with his scooter. When Calvin finally got to the game, the Knights were losing badly. Wagner asked where Calvin had been, but Calvin didn't know what to say. Wagner said Calvin would sit on the bench, Because he missed most of the game, Tracy defended Calvin, telling Wagner to let him play because they wouldn't be in playoffs without Calvin's help all season. Calvin's teammates also supported him. Since they still believed they could win, Wagner put Calvin in the game. Calvin helped the team start scoring and catching up. When they were only 1 point behind, one of Calvin's sneakers got torn and damaged. Calvin looked sad and worried. Tracy noticed something was wrong. Calvin told Tracy he couldn't play well anymore because his basketball talent came from his magical shoes. Tracy thought Calvin was joking, but Calvin was serious. Tracy told Calvin he needed to be brave because they still had to win. Wagner gave instructions for the final play. Calvin told his teammates that whether they made playoffs or not, this would be his last game with them. He wanted to be a regular kid again. His teammates looked shocked, but happy for him. When the game continued, Calvin struggled to get past the other team's best player. His magical shoe was broken, and he was playing with just his natural ability. Tracy encouraged Calvin to keep trying and not give up. Calvin finally got past the player and passed the ball to Tracy. Tracy scored the winning points that sent the Knights to playoffs. Everyone celebrated happily. In the locker room, Calvin felt sad, thinking he might never see Tracy again. Mr. and Mrs. Boyd came to congratulate Calvin. He told him to wait in the parking lot. Calvin said goodbye to Wagner, who said Calvin would be missed and always have a place on the team. Calvin returned to the basketball court and thought about everything that had happened. Instead of going with the Boyds, he left them in the parking lot and returned to the orphanage. When Murph saw him, he said he hadn't expected Calvin to reject the Boyds. Calvin said he hadn't expected it either, but something didn't feel right about leaving. Next day, while Calvin played outside, Ox asked what the best part about being in the NBA was. Calvin said it was room service. When Ox asked what that meant, Calvin explained it was free food at hotels. Ox seemed amazed. As Ox walked away, Calvin heard Tracy asking if room service was really the best part. Calvin was shocked to see Tracy at the orphanage. He asked what Tracy was doing there. Tracy explained he was there because the Knights would now sponsor the orphanage. He also told Calvin he wanted to adopt him as a son. Calvin felt incredibly excited and hugged Tracy tightly. Calvin saw Murph looking sad and asked Tracy to adopt his best friend too. Tracy agreed to adopt both boys, and Murph became very excited. Nobody had seen Stan since the Knights won their important game. Reg got adopted by a loving family and sent a picture to Murph and Calvin, who were very happy living as Tracy's sons. Calvin learned that real magic comes not from special shoes, but from being brave and believing in yourself. Most importantly, he found his dream family when Tracy adopted him and Murph.